So in honor of the Ifugao people, I call them expert sustainable farmers. And then I jumped to this gentleman, Thomas Cannon, who lived on a tiny little pension and lived very austerely. And by the time he died, it was discovered that he had spent over $100,000 of his very tiny amount of money by living very austerely to various folks in need in $1,000, $2,000, and $3,000 and $4,000 checks to people who he had read about who were in need. And so I want to honor him. He would never consider himself, I don't think, a professional philanthropist, but I'll honor him as a philanthropist. He knew something about how to give and to leverage his dollar. And then these are high school students. The last photo is not a high school student, but a student they worked with, youth they worked with, high school students in East Palo Alto, who, through working on projects in brownfields and understanding the OSHA code and knowing about toxic waste issues, they door knocked, they went to city council, they did all the traditional organizing kinds of processes and shut down a toxic waste plant and began to work with community with alternatives. These are high school students who did the most unglamorous thing of looking at all the codes and regs and doing the kind of research and becoming civically involved, learning the process and the art of organizing through their elders who are veteran organizers in the community. And I want to honor the Youth United for Community Action in East Palo Alto, high school students who've done what we hope when we say youth would be civically engaged. And then lastly, just as an example also of something I want to share with you, the people of Le Chambon in France, who were documented in a film, Weapons of the Spirit by PIERRE SAUVAGE, who as an infant had been housed with his family in this village of 5,000, who housed over the period of World War II about 5,000 Jews who were fleeing the Holocaust. And the part that I was particularly moved by in this documentary, Weapons of the Spirit, is when PIERRE SAUVAGE's camera pans to a now elderly couple, and he asks them, "Why did you do what you did? You risked your life." And their answer was not more words. They looked, the couple standing next to each other looked, and they went like this. Many ways to interpret that. My way of interpreting it is, did you have to take a course in moral philosophy or go into the theologians who deal with ethics to know what to do? Isn't it obvious that you rise to what it needs to be done? That's how I interpret it, and that the eloquence of that body gesture spoke more powerfully than all the tons of literature on ethics and morals and the right thing to do. So I want to honor the people of Le Chambon, who I think of as exemplars of doing good in the world. So these are people outside the classroom who are not scholars, people in the community. And what do these other people in the community know? So if you indulge me for a moment and imagine that this circle represents the entire universe of knowledge, skills, capacities, qualities of character that we would need to have in order to have the capacity to address the most intractable social issues of our times. Things that cause people to suffer, and often unnecessarily, and many times through the design of humans. And it causes significant damage and harm to others. So imagine that this circle represents the entire universe, everything we need to know, be able to do. As John Dewey would say, know how and know what. All of it in this circle. Now I'm going to say the most heretical thing. I think that this bit of the circle is academic-based knowledge. Okay, I will be shot in certain institutions where you pay $54,000 a year, and they'll say, for that little wedge of the universe of knowledge, what else is there then in the circle? Well, there's a lot, and I'm just throwing out there forgiveness and healing and fighting injustice and community building and sustainable living and courage and building a well, which, by the way, in some communities, building the well is the most important thing for quality of life. Without quality of water, there is nothing. Integrity, but yet, in certain circles, the academic-based ways of knowing is privileged. And so what happens is the voice of academic-based knowledge as privileged knowledge tends to imply that community-based knowing is less than. And it is often left out, it's marginalized or silenced, either actively or by the way people by the way it is not integrated as a way of knowing that is integral to the learning of the students. In some cases, students are simply placed in the community as if they are there to serve them from a privileged way of knowing, as opposed to serving in the community because there is something there that we need to learn. So I think of service learning as a great opportunity to connect community ways of knowing with academic scholarship. So I am not saying that academic scholarship should be thrown out or diminished, only that we need the means to connect all the pieces of that circle of knowledge together. So I think of service learning as a wonderful way to make those connections, and that to enlarge the circle rather than to diminish all that's in the circle into that one little slice of the pie. So service learning, I think, weaves diverse ways of knowing into a larger circle or a whole circle of knowledge, and that this knowledge diversity, which in some circles they will call epistemological diversity, in a circle of knowledge includes community-based ways of knowing. The way that it's embodied or practiced is it calls for partnerships among groups with different ways of knowing. I think this is a different interpretation of partnerships than what I have been accustomed to hearing from others, where there's a tendency to talk about mutuality, reciprocity, respect, and so forth, but often not because that there are ways of knowing that are lodged in communities that are students that we all urgently need to have as well, and that we view this as necessary and integral to how we learn and how we live. So what I offer is a three-dimensional context for service learning. The first is very familiar to us. We think of it as, oh, of course, it's a pedagogy. It's a different way of teaching, and in the past 10 years, it has gone from the margins to becoming a familiar part of higher education landscape. The part that I'm trying to introduce is that it implicates a way of knowing, that it implicates epistemology as well. It raises questions about the authority of academic knowledge and its place in a larger circle. And it also includes a third part, which I think we need to revisit, and which was a part of the original pioneering spirit of service learning now over 20 years ago. So we're familiar with how do we want to teach, that it's a pedagogical approach, the service learning. Not as familiar that I think it implicates epistemology, and there is a missing dimension, I think, and that is how we want to be. I'll call it calling the ontological question, that the driver really is, how do we want the world to be? How do we want the state of Louisiana to be like in terms of quality of life, in terms of opportunities for everyone, in terms of what it is that we can do to address the underserved? So the three dimensions of pedagogy, epistemology, and I'll call it ontology, but it's like the driver of acting on the world to create what needs to happen that doesn't currently exist. So the question is, how do we want to be in this world, and what world do we want to create? Without it, I think the pedagogy is empty. Then it is just another academic exercise, just another thing, and is it worth all of that it is that you experience, how challenging it is to make it happen? So service learning is also an opportunity to create, I think, small-scale experiments in creating the ideal. And let me just mention my own personal journey. This idea did not spring from just like I thought about it. When I started out as a freshman at the University of the Philippines many years ago, I'm 62 now, so it goes back a long time. When I discovered that the world in the Philippines was full of very poor people, over 60% of the population under poverty in those days, and I don't know how much improved it is today. I went up and down the length and breadth of the Philippines. I slept in camps, volunteered with cicadas, who are migrant labor workers working the sugarcane fields. I see sugarcane out here in Louisiana. It reminds me of the Philippines. The peasants who had lost their land. A lot of suffering. A lot of the people who cut sugarcane by hand did not have enough caloric intake for the output of labor. I learned this as an 18, 19, 20-year-old, and the personal authority of experience of seeing pregnant women, children working in the fields was more powerful than any textbook I've read since. That has stayed with me. But what fueled in me was a fire about what I call the dystopic focus. The dystopic focus, dystopia, the opposite of the ideal, the utopic, is an awareness and consciousness of all the isms. Colonialism, feudalism, racism, classism, all the various ways that we have a mountain of what I call the scholarship of bad news. Tons of scholarship analyzing, deconstructing, critically evaluating the world because actual people suffer. It's not an exercise, simply an abstraction to try to figure out these various isms or different pathologies or different ways that people suffer and our systems of suffering. So that's what fueled me for a very long time. But I burned out because there's only so much that you can go on being angry and furious and working at a rage. Correcting, being involved in resistance struggle, even in the most noble of social movements, is a resistance struggle against, and it's a collective effort to undo or to stop some damage, some things that should not be in the world. And I'm not saying that work is a done deal, only that I think we can't be sustainable that way.